Imagine you are a renowned professor, a brilliant doctor, or a genius engineer sitting in a cafe with your students and colleagues having intellectual discussions. Suddenly, the door opens and a beggar with coarse clothing appears. He walks up to you, interrupts the discussion, and asks a seemingly simple question. How will you react? Something like this is what happens in the 13th century when Jalalaudin Rumi meets Shams of Tabriz for the first time. A meeting that is a grand evolution in the mystical evolution of the planet. But before we dive into the meeting itself, let's quickly just rewind and see who this Rumi figure is before he became the Rumi we know today. Rumi was born 1207 to a native Persian-speaking parents in Waksh, a village on the Waksh River in present-day Tajikistan. The area culturally adjacent to Balkh is where Rumi's father, Bahauddin Walad, was a preacher and jurist. Bahauddin Walad was known as Sultanul Ulama, or the Sultan of the Scholars. But Rumi's father wasn't only a scholar. Sources say he was also a disciple of the spiritual path, with his spiritual lineage connected to the great mystic Najmuddin Kubra. Bahauddin Walad was active in the Balkh area until 1212, when he moved to Samarkand. When the Mongols invaded Central Asia, sometimes between 1215 and 1220, Bahauddin Walad, with his whole family and a group of disciples, set out westwards. During these travels, Rumi encountered one of the most famous mystic Persian poets, Fariduddin Attar, in the Iranian city of Nishapur, located in the province of Khorasan. Attar immediately recognized Rumi's spiritual eminence. He saw the father walking ahead of the son and exclaimed, "Here comes a sea, followed by an ocean." Attar gave the boy his Asrarnameh, a book about the entanglements of the soul in the material world. This meeting had a deep impact on the 18-year-old Rumi, and later on became the inspiration for his works. So right from the beginning, Rumi was born in an academic environment with a learned scholar as a father who was also a mystic. Greater Balkh was at that time a major center of Persian culture, and Islamic spirituality, known as Sufism at that time, had developed there for several centuries. So apart from the household, the entire society that Rumi was growing up in was cultivating his spiritual development. The most important influences upon Rumi, besides his father, were the Persian poets Attar and Sana'i. Rumi expresses his appreciation like this: Attar was the spirit, Sana'i his eyes twine, and in time thereafter came we in their train. Rumi mentions in another poem, Attar has traversed the 7 cities of love, we are still at the turn of one. Rumi later settled in Konya, Turkey, which is in the 13th century a meeting point for many cultures at the western edge of the Silk Road, a place where Muslim, Christian, Hindu and even Buddhist travelers mingled. Here was Rumi, at the age of 37, a renowned doctor of theology, the center of his own divinity school. He was a Venusian lover of the beautiful and the good, a scholar, an artist with a huge following and eager disciples. He was riding his donkey, surrounded by his students, when Shams suddenly appeared. Who was Shams Tabrizi? He is a legend among mystics, yet not much details are available of his life. Shams was a wandering dervish monk, rough-hewn and sinewy, a street bodhisattva who mingled with laborers and camel drivers. He had no school. Shams was sometimes lost in mystical awareness for 3 or 4 days. He took work as a mason to balance his visionary bewilderment with hard physical labor. When he was paid, he contrived to slip his wages into another worker's jacket before he left. He never stayed anywhere long. Whenever students began to gather around him, as they inevitably did, he excused himself for a drink of water, wrapped his black cloak around himself, and was gone. He did not want followers or fame. He only wanted to find a disciple who could bear the spiritual mysteries that were buried in his chest. Shams traveled the Middle East searching for a soul friend, a person who could endure his company, a man to be his spiritual equal. After many years of travel and many whispered prayers, a voice came to him asking, "What will you give in return for such a company?" Shams hesitated not and cried out, "My head!" The answer came, "The one you seek is Jalalaudin of Konya." And Shams set out for the long journey to Konya. Shams took firm steps towards Rumi's donkey, grabbed hold of the donkey's reins and asked a seemingly simple question. Who was greater, Muhammad or Aba Yazid Bastami? For Aba Yazid said, Subhani ma a'zama sha'ni. Glory be to me, there is no greater than me. While Muhammad said, Ma arafnak haqqa ma'rifatik. I have not known you as you deserve to be known. For any Muslim, nonetheless an Islamic scholar, this question appears as a simple theological question. Without doubt, Rumi, like other Muslims and scholars, have discussed the greatness of Prophet Muhammad above other prophets and have had well-versed arguments for his elevated status. Yet, Rumi's reaction was really unexpected, especially for his students. He fainted, falling down off the donkey unconscious. Shams had set out on a long journey, preparing and concentrating all of his spiritual energy into one sentence, to deliver a blow that would shake Rumi to his foundation. And that is what happened. Among mystic masters, this type of spiritual blows in the shape of one-liners is quite common, and there are many other examples in ancient and modern history. When Rumi came to his senses, he exclaimed, Muhammad was greater. For Aba Yazid took one sip of the divine ocean and satisfied his thirst, while Muhammad's thirst was infinite. This tied their spiritual bond, and with their friendship, categories of teacher and student, lover and beloved, master and disciple dissolved. Rumi later describes this encounter as, the God that I worshipped all my life, I saw that day in the shape of a man. In another poem of his, he writes like this, مرده بودم زنده شدم گریه بودم خنده شدم دولت عشق آمد و من دولت پاینده شدم I was dead and became alive. I was crying and started laughing. The kingdom of love came and I became immortal. What followed was an intense spiritual program, including retreats and seclusions. Rumi withdrew from his friends, his students, and his scholarly positions to spend time with his newfound master, learning the spiritual mysteries. There are many stories of how Shams, layer by layer, peeled off Rumi's entire character and built him up from new. For example, in one story, he asks Rumi to go and fetch some wine from the Jewish district, whereupon Rumi goes there, gets a bottle of wine, and comes back to Shams. Shams tells him to pour a cup. When Rumi pours the wine, Shams tells him to drink it, and when Rumi drinks it, it has miraculously become just grape juice. Rumi describes this rebuilding process of his spiritual characters in a poem of his that goes like this. گفت که تو زیرکی مست خیال و شکی گول شدم هول شدم و از همه پراکنده شدم گفت که تو شمع شدی قبله این جمع شدی جمع نیم شمع نیم دور پراکنده شدم. He said, you're clever, drunk on fantasies and doubt. I became a fool, a coward, and broke off from everyone. He said, you're a candle, the qibla of this society. I left the gathering, I put out the candle and became scattered smoke. گفت که شیخی و سری پیش رو راهبری شیخ نیم پیش نیم امر تو را بنده شدم. گفت که با بال و پری من پر و بالت ندهم در هوس بال و پرش بی پر و پراکنده شدم. He said, you're a sheikh, a leader and a guide. I gave up priesthood and the leadership and became a slave to your command. He said, you have wings and feathers, I will not teach you to fly. In the aspiration to fly, I cut off my feathers and wings. Rumi's and Shams' bond grew stronger with each day passing, and Rumi's poetry became more and more inspired by his encounters with Shams. In another poem of his, he writes, what was said to the rose that made it open was said to me here in my chest. Naturally, this caused a lot of irritation, anger, and envy among Rumi's disciples. Seeing their master being transformed so quickly by this wandering dervish was not welcomed. Similar to the prophets, Shams was most likely viewed as a magician who had enchanted Rumi. As much as they tried to persuade Rumi to leave Shams, it was of no avail until they finally, after around a year, managed to chase away Shams, who left Rumi in ruins. This is called Ghaybatul Sughra, the minor occultation that occurred on 1246, and what followed was the period of the most ecstatic verses of longing from Rumi. Why did Shams leave Rumi? Shams knew exactly what he was doing when he walked away, because this phase of loneliness was necessary for Rumi to reach the next level of the spiritual path. After many blood and tear-filled poems and searching, Rumi found out about Shams' whereabouts in Damascus and sent his son Sultan Walad to fetch him. Legend has it that Sultan Walad found Shams in a coffee shop sitting with a young Italian man, later known as the Christian mystic Francis of Assisi, who had many spiritual visions and founded his own spiritual order. If Shams had such a life-blowing impact on the older academic Rumi, no doubt he must have affected the young Francis deeply. Sultan Walad managed to persuade Shams to return to Konya, and the divine reunion between Rumi and Shams continued for another couple of years before Shams disappeared forever, most likely killed by Rumi's disciples. The source of Shams' teachings was the knowledge of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, who is also known as the master of mystics. Shams Tabrizi's tomb lays in Khouy, Iran, besides a tower monument in a memorial park, and has been nominated as a World Cultural Heritage Center by UNESCO. The teacher of Mullah Sadra, Sheikh Bahai, says about Rumi and his Masnavi, I'm not saying he's a prophet, but he has a book. If Rumi was created for the world, Shams was created for Rumi. Shams was needed to turn the spiritual scholar Rumi into the universal Rumi that will inspire people forever. as he says himself, "When we die, don't seek our tombs in the graves, but in the heart of men."